most newsworthy and most surprising finding in these data are that if people feel the government is transparent, it shares information willingly, is providing a lot more responsiveness to citizens, they feel good about a lot more aspects of their community. There is a sort of cascading effect from government being transparent that seems to provide a halo over lots of other institutions. They feel better about their media institutions if they think the government is transparent. They feel better about their own capacity to influence change in their community. They feel better about the other civic organizations in their communities, from the hospitals to the groups that serve the poor to their churches. It's just an array of things that they feel better about. Not necessarily to say, though, that lots of people feel their government is transparent. They're only a portion, about a quarter of people will give their government good marks for that. And so one of the things that you might be thinking now as you go back and try to change the information ecosystem is that the hydraulics of it works particularly well if you get your government just to do more and share more and be more forthcoming with the data, maybe breaking with the model that currently exists of FOIA. You know, now we have to beg for this stuff to come out of government. It turns out they share more, especially willingly. There might be a real civic payoff from that. The second big thing we noticed in the surveys is that people have an overwhelming sense that the ecosystem itself has grown. There are ways in which that obviously plays out in the technology sphere. Actually, the communities arranged themselves pretty interestingly when it came to broadband. 3/4 of San Jose residents have broadband at home. 2/3 of Philadelphia residents have broadband at home. And 50% of Macon residents have broadband at home. So we had a nice diversity of broadband. But the interesting thing is, if people had broadband at home, they were much more engaged with all kinds of information in their communities, and they were content creators. So the broadband piece relates very much to the social side of information sharing. If you have broadband at home, you're much more likely to use a social network site to get community news and share community news. So there's a participatory side to it as well. You're much more likely to use Twitter to get that kind of information. You're much more likely to gather local information from a blog. You're also more likely to use simpler tools like email news listservs or just group mailing lists and things like that. Another way, of course, that we see the information system growing, and people have expressed that to us, is that more than 80% of the people in all of these communities had cell phones. 42% of them use their cell phones to connect to the internet. And so we walked them through a battery of questions about engagement with local information, asking them whether they got some material by their wired computer and some by their cell phone. And increasingly, we found now that people are anxious to get real-time information or deal with government on their terms when they happen to have a need, whether they're near a wired computer or not. So for instance, we asked about engaging with local officials. About 36% of the people in these communities had done that, but about a fifth of them had used their cell phones to do that. We asked about finding information about property taxes. About a third of people in these communities had done that, but about 10% of them had used their cell phones and the internet connections on their phones to get information about that. We asked about local libraries. Did they use broadband connections or other things to find out what was available at the local library and to tell them what was going on? About a quarter of people used their cell phones to be in exchange with their libraries and find out what was available at libraries and get librarians to answer their questions. Just on the social side, about half the people now who have internet connections, and especially those with broadbands, are content creators. So that's a way that they're sharing information in their community. One of the most striking things we saw, though, and it very much relates to the story that Steve Waldman was telling yesterday, is that when we asked people how they used their broadband connections and what made them feel particularly good, particularly more competent as they were using them, they scored very high marks in broadband use for personal items. If they wanted to get personal health information, if they wanted to look at material that was of personal interest to them, they loved it, and they said broadband made a huge difference in their lives. However, if they were trying to engage with government, if they were trying to learn about the performance of government officials, if they were trying to be in communication with government officials, they were much less likely to be satisfied even with a broadband connection, because this is such a complicated space for them to negotiate, and it's in many respects not a hospitable place for them to be in negotiation. The final thing we saw very much speaks to this issue of skills. And it related to the three ways that, that sort of we at Pew think about the way that people use information in their lives. And we talk about how you first get their attention, then you get their assessment, or how they use their social networks and other judgments that they make about what's quality information and what's not information. And now, of course, these tools are used for action, for ways to engage the community. And what we heard back loudly from these respondents is this is because the system is bigger and because it's more complicated, this is a harder system to navigate than it used to be, and particularly because the volume of information has grown. About 44% of the people in these communities say that compared to 5 years ago, they're getting more local information than they did. About 10% said they're getting less information. So it seems in many respects overwhelming, or at least harder to navigate in this. And the data speak about their frustrations of dealing with people. Each of these communities has a pretty nice government portal of information, which is one of the hallmarks of, one of the indicators that the Knight Commission identified. But only half the people in these communities, on average, knew that that portal existed. When we marched them through the scavenger hunt and asked for the way that they navigated to information, many of them sort of used a haphazard system that sometimes involved search engines, sometimes involved finding a local portal, usually with a local news operation, not the government. And in many cases, when they were frustrated that they couldn't get to what they wanted, they fell back on their personal networks. They found somebody who could help them find the person in City Hall who could help solve their problems. This is a really important part of the story because surveys only get you so far in this data. We're happy to share these survey instruments. They're all up on our website. We at Pew would be delighted to work with you if you wanted to think about doing the surveys in these communities. But really, the takeaway message is the one that Mayar and Tony have already referred to. The way that people talk back to us about their concerns. The system is kind of working fine in some respects. They like the work of the Knight Commission. But what they were most anxious to talk about in the community workshops is people's own capacities to find information, to share it with other people, and to act on it. And so that's a point now to come back to the story about what actually happened in those community workshops.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Lee. As Lee said, in each of the pilot communities, we hosted a series of conversations and workshops. And I think for me,